Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Nora Neelijon and I'm Director of the Information Law and Policy Centre, one of the academic centres based at the University of London's Institute for Advanced Legal Studies. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us for this event, which forms part of the Centre's seminar series on AI and the Humanities, Transforming Society. These seminars explore the societal impacts of AI-based technologies and systems, and the role of the humanities and social sciences in providing key insights and expert analysis, enabling an open dialogue on important and complex issues with the public. And today it is my very great pleasure to chair and introduce our distinguished panel today for a very timely and important discussion on the role of ethics and AI governance within the particular context of calls to decolonize AI made by affected groups from various regions across the world, and by commentators with expertise in the critique of AI ethics and related fields of scholarship. AI ethics has arisen as the dominant discourse for anticipating the harms of emerging technological systems of AI and related technologies. These include, but of course are not limited to, facial recognition systems, online targeting, advertisement, and profiling. These AI-based systems and related emerging technologies have already led to the manifestation of known societal harms, and these include online abuse, harassment, and trolling, to widespread disinformation and the manipulation of democratic elections. In an echo of colonial sentiment, the ethical and legal standards emanating largely from Europe are self-considered to constitute its critical edge in the global AI arms race. But what effects have these standards had for post-colonial places and people? Our lead speaker today, presenting her latest research with us on these important issues and global governance challenges, is Dr. Rachel Adams. Dr. Adams is the principal researcher at Research ICT Africa, where she directs the Africa Just AI Centre. She is the project lead of the African Observatory on Responsible AI and is the principal investigator of the Global Index on Responsible AI. Rachel has published widely in areas such as AI and society, gender and AI, transparency, open data, and data protection. She is also the author of Transparency, New Trajectories in Law, published by Routledge in 2020, and the lead author of Human Rights and the Fourth Industrial Revolution in South Africa, published by HRC Press in 2021. Following her main presentation, interventions will be provided by our two discussants, Dr. Christopher O'Kay and Professor Siva Vayanathan. Rachel, Christopher, Siva, you're very welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing your leading expertise and insights with us. In terms of the format for this seminar, once the panel has presented, we will open up the discussion to the digital floor. So please include any questions or comments you have for our panel in the chat box below, and we will try to address as many questions as possible in the remaining time that we have. So now I'd like to thank our speakers and you again for joining us today and invite Dr. Rachel Adams to begin today's seminar on the empire of AI, AI ethics and governance. Rachel, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Nora. It is a very great pleasure to be back here. For those of you who don't know, I did my postdoc at the Information Law and Policy Centre with Nora in 2018, and it was the beginning of a wonderful journey together and into a lot of this work. So since then, I've been based in South Africa for 15 years, except for this break when I came to the UK to work with Nora in 2018. So I'm speaking from a number of different perspectives. My work over the last 3 years has been really supporting African governments and other actors from across the global South in thinking about what are the best responses to address the types of harms and concerns and potential opportunities. It's always framed in terms of opportunities of AI and digital technologies. And of course, so much of the literature and the work that's been done is emanating out of other parts of the world. So there's a critical need to think about how do we develop locally appropriate policy and regulatory responses to how AI is manifesting here on the African continent and in other parts of the world. that's the more practical side of this question. The deeper thinking that I've been doing is around the concept of decolonization, what it means for thinking critically about artificial intelligence and how it's working within the world today. And what I'm going to be speaking on is part of a larger book project that I wish there was more time to do. But it's a book project that's trying to trace the imperial tendencies at work within the kind of large complex of artificial intelligence that manifests globally in different ways. So this is part of that. And this is also part of what has been a pressing research question for me over the past few years that's tied these kind of two different perspectives together. And it arises from a deep concern that AI is fundamentally worsening global inequality and inequality between and within nations, but global inequality particularly. And we don't quite have the tools and the concepts with which to gauge this and generate the evidence to understand this better. But of course, decoloniality is an important concept here because so much of the experience of global inequality has been historically produced because of European colonialism in the last 500 years. So there's some important questions that I want to try. I'm not going to tie it all together here, but that's what's going on in the back of my mind. That's what's going on in other work that I'm engaged in. And here I'm going to be addressing the question of AI ethics. There is a very difficult question about whether AI ethics is a discourse that helps rationalize and justify the global imperial project of AI, or whether it's a discourse and a mechanism to help address the risks that it poses, and that question is not absolute. It functions differently and is experienced differently in different parts of the world. So, just to situate some of what I want to discuss today, I've put here some of the other work that has been important to me and has come up as important recently and over the past few years, that points to this kind of wider question of what is the relationship between AI, historical colonialism, new forms of coloniality, and imperialism. I also want to quickly pause on what decolonization means. It doesn't have a singular meaning. It is not only a political or theoretical concept. It's a political movement, and it means something. Of course, it means something different than what it meant 20, 30, 40 years ago with formal decolonization of the European colonies. But the way I'm working with it as this idea of the search for freedom, human dignity, and recommunitization that has been marred by colonial enterprises and their afterlives. Decolonization does not start and end with AI. AI is a new frontier which it has to attend to. But there's two imperatives that are important here. First is that this idea of decolonization asks us to make intelligible, to help see and detect, and then to abolish the continued operations of coloniality at work in the world today. So at work in this context through AI. And then to collectively reimagine a different kind of world space and a new form of democracy of all the world, centered on this very radical idea of true human equality, which sounds very much like something we have accepted and we're working with today, but it has to be different. It has to be a radical reevaluation of what democracy means and is experienced as, and what true human equality means and is experienced as. So I'm going to, if my slides will move forward, there they are. I'm going to look at three cases, I suppose, of where the concept and the operations of AI ethics is seen at work, and talk through some of the kind of problems and ways of engaging with these cases. So we have, of course, and Nora mentioned this at the beginning, the questions around censorship and content moderation, and how critical this, of course, is for the provision of democracy, and enforcing and protecting democratic orders in different parts of the world. But it looks different in different places. So on the left of the screen here is a report that came out in The Continent, which is a relatively new newspaper established a couple of years ago for the African continent, that explores the role of Facebook in inflaming the tensions and the conflict in Tigray in Ethiopia. And this comes at a time when a huge portion of the Twitter team, the ethics team, the responsible AI team within Twitter was disbanded. But it talks about the kind of global distribution and allocation of content moderation teams and resources, and how so much of that team is concentrated in the US. And then you have one or two people that might be responsible for addressing all the kind of potentially inflammatory content in a country like Ethiopia. And they may or may not have the linguistic skills needed to detect what might be an inflammatory comment and what might not be. And the algorithmic systems are not sophisticated enough to be attenuated to different local languages. Another example here is in Israel and Palestine, where the Israeli government took down pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli content from various different platforms, including Twitter, and how easy that was compared to where in Ethiopia it was not possible to take down inflammatory content. There was not that kind of infrastructure. I think another interesting point on the Palestinian case was how pro-Palestinian activists twisted and changed the way in which they were writing particular words or hashtags for movements with different the use of a different alphabet or a number or a symbol, so that it wouldn't be picked up by the algorithmic content moderation. Colleagues of mine in Ethiopia, I wanted to mention this earlier, but have been looking at what are the kind of ethical principles that need to be protected within AI ethics pertinent for that particular context, and talk about the need to explicitly reference ethnic profiling and the huge risks that come with ethnic profiling, which I think is an important point, because we talk a lot about gender and race, and we forget to, or we don't explicitly name some of the other minority groups or the other at-risk groups that might be happening elsewhere. The second example I wanted to turn to was the big issue of Cambridge Analytica and the history of this technology in other parts of the world. What I found really interesting was Christopher Wiley's explanation of how it was the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, called Strategic Communications Laboratories. And they had worked in Trinidad and Tobago, but also Kenya, Morocco, Brazil, Mexico, all sorts of countries prior to the 2016 US presidential campaign and British referendum. And he talked about how Trinidad and Tobago was the ideal laboratory to run our experiments at scale. And I just want to pause on that language and come back to that language of using the Global South as this laboratory for trialing and experimenting with new technologies on populations that don't matter as much, or are positioned as not mattering as much. This is the third point I wanted to, or the third case I wanted to come to, the ethics of making ethical AI. I think this case on the left, the Zimbabwean case where CloudWalk, a Chinese facial recognition company, bought the biometric database of faces from the Zimbabwean government in 2018, but this was under the guise of offering a new digital ID system that would provide for fairer elections for Zimbabwe. But it came at a time when the Gender Shades report had come out by Timnit Gebru and Joy Bulawemroy, and there was this enormous pressure to make more ethical, make the data more representative for facial recognition technologies by having more representative data, and the need to collect more African data and faces to train facial recognition technologies. There were a whole host of issues that we could go into and talk about with this particular case. And then the other one that I wanted to raise was with Daniel Mutuang as the Facebook whistleblower in Kenya that blew the whistle on the working conditions of this kind of content moderation lab in Kenya, where the Facebook lab, where there were various workers who and we know their story, working to remove distressing images, but were subject to the most awful working conditions and going through harrowing images, thousands by the thousands on a daily basis. So I think for me, what I have been concerned with is the lack of critical engagement around the concept of ethics itself. There's been huge discussion on the limits of AI ethics as a governance framework, and that has much merit, and some of which I will go into today. But the idea of ethics itself, the kind of critical history of where this concept in its framing within AI ethics discourse comes from, has not received much critical attention, and is based on very Eurocentric ideas of morality, of legality and governance, and individual personhood. Akanle and colleagues talk about ethics and morality as this kind of key differentiator within colonial times. With this quote that colonialism came with a bifurcation, so a dividing of the sacred and the profane. If it was not considered civil by the colonizers, it was uncivil, savage, profane, and repulsive. If it was approved by the colonial powers, then it was modern, civil, morally good, and sacred. So the result of this was that ethics was positioned as this value of Europe that was to be proselytized on the Global South, on the colonies, which in relation to the ethical West were positioned as what Chilman Mbembe has described as pre-ethical or without ethics. This works in the favor of European colonizers insofar as it helps justify the colonial mission as Western benevolence and as this civilizing mission. But it also allows the colonial powers to treat the colonies as this place without ethics, this place which could be used as a laboratory for scientific progress, and where the collateral damage of scientific advancement could be safely imbibed in places and by people considered expendable, which is precisely the kind of behavior we saw with the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. So I think there's a series of questions to be asking, and these are questions that have been very, very important in the work I've been doing. Questions around who is AI serving. Munn, in his essay from 2022, from last year, on the uselessness of ethics, makes a really insightful point about, does the benefits of AI come at the costs of the risk to others? And certainly that is much of what I have been concerned with in some of the work I've been doing here. And it's a very complicated question in terms of showing what the benefits and the costs are, but the benefits of kind of efficiency and fair content moderation, the material production of that efficiency and that fair content moderation is outsourced to somewhere else where there are harms and costs. And then who is AI ethics serving, and at what cost to other groups? And some of this is what those examples I've shown is trying to illustrate. There is also an interesting question about whose values are at risk from AI. And certainly some of the research that I've been supporting here, so not doing myself, but working with others around, is looking at which African values are at risk from AI and how do they need to then factor into the principles that should be at the base and the foundation of an locally appropriate AI ethics framework. I think it's interesting how this question comes to be reflected in Western fears around how technology from China comes with, is embedded with Chinese values, or values that are not of the West, and the fear around that, but that question's not reversed. So when these technologies developed from one part of the world is exported to another part of the world, there's not that same consideration of what values are we imposing on another part of the world, and at what cost to the values that may be enshrined and important there. And then if AI operates globally, and we know the kind of value systems, the value chains, the supply chains of AI is global, and we need some kind of global regulation. Big tech operates globally. How can we find more pluralistic forms of AI ethics upon which to base these kind of regulatory frameworks and responses? And then lastly, how do we broaden AI ethics to address precisely these questions and harms that exist within the value chain and the supply chain of the production and arguably end of cycle of AI technologies? So I just briefly, let me just check what the time, okay, I've got a few more minutes, but just two more slides. Two more slides. So in terms of looking at this alternative and considering other ways of approaching the kind of philosophical basis that underlies AI ethics and an ethics of looking at the relationship between societies and humans and the technologies we use and produce, I've been doing some research into African philosophical histories of technology, and some interesting points arose that I wanted to point out here. So the first was around the symbolic order of craft, innovation, and technology in Central and Western African histories told by Achille Mbembe, was about technology and innovation and craft being transmorphic, creating new worlds, have a D there, and realities through new material and symbolic relations that were always fluid and changing. So they were not hegemonic, they didn't serve hegemony and did not seek to create a singular kind of idea of how the world needs to be. They did not fix things in its place, which arguably a lot of AI technologies like large language models and ChatGPT are working to kind of fix the single idea of what an answer to a question could be, and a kind of singular discourse for the world. But this was a kind of very different, less fixed way of seeing the impact and implications of technologies for society as an aperture to new worlds and new ways of thinking. And then cyclical ideas about the progression of knowledge and wisdom and intelligence that comes to manifest in craft and technologies, which served as an interesting counterpoint to this idea of Western progress always being on the upward trajectory, which we know is a fallacy, because AI, for example, has had its summers and its winters. So it maybe indicates to a future that is less technologically determined, as much of the kind of current discourse suggests. And then a reposition of human relationality with technology as part of this kind of, and this should be in quotations from, as part of participatory ecosystems, as in which the world was not an object to be conquered, but a reserve of potentials, and in which there was no pure and absolute power, but that which was the source of life and of fecundity. So that's again from Mbembe, but technology not as this tool with which to dominate over the world, which in kind of Western histories it's been shown as, but as this kind of source of power and source of new life, in thinking in much more relational terms. So if we think of how this comes together in moving towards an alternate AI ethics governance for different parts of the world, or for thinking in more pluralistic ways about how global AI governance needs to move. I've just pulled some work that I think has been important. The piece by Mohammed Ping and Isaacs on decoloniality and foresight mentions this idea of intercultural ethics, and there was also a special issue of Philosophy and Technology on digital intercultural ethics, which I thought was very valuable and a very interesting kind of approach. I think there's more that could be done to explore what that looks like in the context of AI, because in this article there was not a huge amount on it. And then Sibelo Mhlambi wrote about Ubuntuism, which is a philosophy that comes from Southern Africa, and is much more situated within this kind of relational framework of the relationship between humans and their societies, but has also been applied more broadly to humans and other forms of life. Which is also a very, very, very interesting kind of counterpoint and expansion of the current framing around AI ethics. And then some important work, I think, based from the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Banjul Charter, where it talks about collective people's rights. But also this idea of kind of freedom ethics. I've just included a screenshot here from Article 19 and Article 20, but it talks about how people must not be subject to domination, whether by a foreign power, an economic power, or a political power, and the right to self-determination. And Thompson Chingeta, who's a Zimbabwean scholar, has written about the importance of, or the value of this framework in thinking about autonomous weapon systems and the kinds of ethical frameworks that we might need to think about in addressing those kinds of major challenges within the application of AI in very high risk settings. So I'm going to pause there. I am very much looking forward to the discussion with Christopher and Siva, and let me stop sharing. Thanks, Nora. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you have. And thank you so much, Rachel, for such a rich and detailed and provocative overview of all the different projects and research that you're working on right now in terms of looking into this critique of AI ethics and the origins of its values. You gave such a really fantastic overview of its historical development, and that was coupled, I think, very accessibly and very clearly in terms of some of the more problematic case studies of where we have an inconsistent application, if you will, of how a development of AI ethical standards are being developed and also applied in particular countries in the global south. And you give specific examples about the development of facial recognition, the unrepresentative data sets are being used to develop that particular software, which of course, that interestingly isn't a challenge just unique to the global south. It's something that's manifested itself the world over. But I think this goes back to the other very important point that you raised, Rachel, that this is a global space, both in terms of its technical development and in terms of acknowledging that the governance needs to apply to the entire supply chain and all the values therein. I think there are some really significant questions that have yet to be addressed there, but I think fantastically you are exploring in your work and the related projects that you mentioned. I thought the point you made regarding the inverse of considering the impact of particular types of discourse around values and morality and ethics in the space of AI governance and their impact going from the West, defined in terms of coming from European jurisdictions and other countries considered to be within the West, and their impact in other jurisdictions beyond Europe, such as Africa and Asia and other jurisdictions, how significant that is in terms of finding some point of reconciliation, or if not that, then at least a shift away from that unilateral approach, whereby these are the values that will embed these frameworks and these standards and systems, and anything different is regarded as problematic. And you gave the example about Chinese developed software and technology as the other in terms of that post-colonial discourse, which I think is very significant to this overall conversation. So so much more I would love to engage with and to discuss with you, but I must force myself to move on. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first discussant on the panel today, and that is Dr. Christopher Ogay. Christopher is Senior Lecturer in Digital Approaches to Literature at the Institute of English Studies within the University of London School of Advanced Studies. His research focuses on textual scholarship, digital humanities, and creative and critical methods for studying book history and literary texts. Before coming to London, he was an associate editor at the Mark Twain Papers and Project at the University of California, Berkeley, and held postdoctoral fellowships at Boston University and the University of Maine. Christopher, whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a lot that I just heard that I think should be followed up on, and I'll try to do that as best as I can in the subsequent conversation too. But there were just some major points that I wanted to highlight, because so much of what Rachel said is really germane to larger developments in the computing industry that are worth noting, but also some of the recent developments that have caught everybody's attention on the nature of OpenAI's new technologies, ChatGPT, large language models, the effects of that. But I'd also just add something else too, which is a growing awareness of ethical computing as a kind of response to the environmental concerns that computing has brought about, and particularly AI. So I want to just touch on those bits before I try to tie it in with Rachel's very wise points. So I just popped in the chat a quote from one of my favorite computing pioneers, Alan Kay. Alan Kay, you may know, was a leading programming engineer in the 60s and 70s. He is largely credited for helping to invent the first object-oriented programming language, which was developed into what's called Smalltalk. And he was also really instrumental in creating a computer prototype called Dynabook, which was basically a proto laptop, but it was used specifically for teaching children how to program and how to compute. And the reason why I bring him up is that he represents to me a lost opportunity that that digital technology did not really take up, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But the lost opportunity is the inability to name the problem that we're trying to solve with computers. So he says we're not solving anybody's problem here because we don't know what the problem is. That sounds to dovetail nicely with what Rachel was saying, that we need to have a language for describing the problems that have arisen as a result of technologies like AI, but also computing more generally. So it's something that Kay noticed and eventually lamented, because like another great pioneering computing, a great pioneer in computing, Ted Nelson said, the problem with digital technology is that it's simply shop windows now. It's all commerce. It's all corporate, and as a result, the elements of craft that were alluded to in Rachel's talk, which are very apt indeed, the elements of craft as well as creativity were kind of pulled out of the essential enterprise that was digital technology. And I think Kay was quite prescient on this issue. Alan Kay is a great person to think about as a kind of ethical compass, I think, on how we could start to think better about solving some of these problems. But on a broader sense too, I just want to say that the recent successes, and I put successes in air quotes, of AI have really been driven by two major developments. One of them is the advances in hardware, computer hardware, that'll just allow for more memory retention and just faster performance in computing, but also by allowing machines to do things in parallel. Now, I bring that up because one of the ethical implications of AI is the development of this hardware, which inevitably means going into places like the Global South and mining for more materials. And this also involves greater oil extraction. So, to what end are we sacrificing precious natural resources to develop these technologies? So that's one element. The second element is the increasing relevance of big data, just collecting huge data sets, or what people in AI might call training data, or language models, which also connects to another major development, which is this new use of algorithms called deep learning. I'm not an expert in deep learning, but it's just something that has been developed that's become pretty much at the center of most AI systems developments. And deep learning itself has some real problems, as I'll mention in a moment. So the reason why I bring this up is that AI is inevitably tied to physical, natural resources that often exploit the Global South. That's one thing. Another thing is that it is almost always directly tied toward commerce. And this is where I think Alan Kay would also say that there was really a turning point in the history of AI and computing more generally, when in roughly the mid 1990s to mid early 2000s, technologies such as this were primarily a means for making money, for profit, which itself, engenders a lot of these ethical issues that we've been hearing about. So what can we do about this? This is the question, right? I've been very interested lately in the commentator Gary Marcus, who you may have heard of. He's become a bit famous if you're interested in these discourses. He's suggested that there needs to be a program of resistance to deal with the influx of these AI technologies. He's encouraged a variety of things, such as various platforms, whether it's scientific publications or Twitter or whatever to just ban auto-generated content, particularly because such content is leading to more misinformation, which again was alluded to. And as a result, countries should consider new policies and put a lot of thought, and I would say interdisciplinary thought between philosophers and legal scholars and so on about policies of information. But he's also pointed out that provenance is going to become an extremely important concept for us as we consider these AI technologies. Now, provenance could mean knowing where your data came from. If it came from a large language model, you're often not privy to the full context of that data collection, which is certainly true when you think about things like Cambridge Analytica and so on. But provenance also relates to validation, verification, authentication of actual agents, right? People, people who experience the world, not bots that are generating text from large language models. And I think Marcus's final suggestion, at least insofar as I've seen his suggestions, is to build a new kind of AI to resist the prevalence now of large language models. One of the reasons why we're seeing so many problems, I think, with AI is because of its dependence on large language models. Large language models lack mechanisms for verifying truth, and they also don't allow for crucial judgments that humans often make regarding the parsing of information. That is to say that a large language model in AI models language. It's really good at that. But it doesn't model knowledge. It doesn't model wisdom, you could even say, or ethics. If you go to ChatGPT right now and ask it any kind of question that involves any kind of ethical quandary, it almost always equivocates. And if it doesn't equivocate, it might even give you some false information. And that's because this is basically a very fancy autocomplete mechanism that makes guesses based on the existing language model, but not based on context. AI using large language models is very good at predicting a move, as it were, linguistically, in a closed system. This is why it's good at chess. But the world is not a closed system, as we know. Ethics requires knowledge of being in the world and dealing with ambiguities and parsing them. And this is how most human beings think and read, and these AI technologies don't quite do that so well. So the core problem really is, well, there are two core problems. One is neoliberalism and the libertarian ethos of these tech companies that see data as almost always a possibility for profit, which always means exploitation. But the other problem is trust. How can you trust what content means? How can you trust that the agent of information in a digital space is trustworthy? And where does that information even come from? So I'll just wrap up my comments by returning to the great point about craft. And you mentioned Ubuntu because it just happens to be the case that one of the better operating systems for having more computing control is also called Ubuntu. So that goes to my major point that in addition to considering some of the issues that Gary Marcus raises, that digital literacy, and particularly a digital literacy that involves greater capacity for craft and data control, could lead to more ethical computing practices and could hopefully provide the kind of resistance that Marcus alludes to. So I'll just finish by promoting a little link that it makes a very small contribution in this space, and this is based at the School of Advanced Study here in partnership with other constituencies in the UK. It's called Digital Humanities Climate Coalition. And we've developed a little chapter on maximal computing, but mostly dealing with large language models, AI, and machine learning that is environmentally sustainable and that accounts for the wide range of ethical issues that that Rachel has alluded to. With that, I think I will pass the virtual mic to Siva. Thank you very much.
Hi. Hey, thank you so much. I apologize for disappearing for a few minutes. I had some Zoom issues. So I've switched to my phone and I think it's working. Chris, can you give me a thumbs up? All right, good. Everyone can hear me. So thank you, Chris. Those comments are extremely helpful, and we're lucky that mine don't actually step on yours, which can sometimes happen in these moments. We hadn't talked about this before, so it's nice that we're actually approaching Rachel's paper from different angles, and I think we can both be helpful here. So I'm super excited about this subject, super excited about Rachel's paper. I think it's long overdue. I've needed this sort of interrogation of AI from literally a different position in the world. Rachel stands and sits in a completely different part of the world than I do, than Chris does, and that's essential to any of these approaches. So this is so refreshing and so exciting. I'm also excited about the idea that Rachel is unpacking, to some degree, undermining the very terms we're discussing here: artificial intelligence and ethics. In fact, I would urge Rachel to go farther in the dismantling of these three terms. There is nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. For that matter, there's nothing mechanistic about machine learning. Artificial intelligence systems, which is really a terrible name for what we're talking about, are socio-technical systems, much like most systems that we use, most technical systems we use. They are embedded in human relations, and human relations and decisions and histories and records and traces and exercises of power are embedded in those systems themselves. There is nothing different about artificial intelligence systems in the sense that they are part of us. They are, as McLuhan would argue, extensions of us, for better or worse. And we've seen them operate both for better and for worse. But the extent of the better and the extent of the worse is largely dependent on our recognition of these systems as socio-technical systems, and not as something outside of us, not as something that acts upon us, not as something that performs magic upon us. The greatest favor we can do as critics and scholars of these systems is to demystify them, right? To remove any sense of the superpower of the religious from these systems. And I think it's, as Rachel moves this into a book project, I would be more excited to see her take on this rhetoric of evangelism of AI, right? This idea that there is a missionary zeal to expanding the power and the reach of these systems into our lives, done based on certain assumptions, right? There's the teleological, right? That this is a necessary unfolding of the future, that we should not question and cannot question because AI is coming and you better deal with it, right? That's a terrible fallacy. We've seen this time and time again throughout our technological histories. And then there is the prescriptive or the normative, the notion that our lives must necessarily be improved by these systems that will, and this is often in the sales pitch, that will remove human biases from our decision making. So in the early days of predictive policing, the pitch was, or the early days of using artificial intelligence systems for instance, in American courts, often assessing the risk of recidivism for criminals or criminal defendants during sentencing. The argument was that, well, look, we have a lot of racists and a lot of classists and a lot of sexists operating in our law enforcement system. If we would remove these decisions from these messy humans, we can have less discriminatory systems. Of course, we all know through the work of so many people that that's a huge fallacy. So I would love to see Rachel dig deeper into the into the missionary zeal with which AI systems have been pushed upon us, sold to us. I think that there's a way we can find, and Rachel can find, echoes, coincidences, rhetorical structures that are alarmingly similar between what we've seen at work with the expansion of these systems around the world and the rhetoric that stood behind the white man's burden, right? That justified so much colonialism. This is not an accident. It's a habit of thought so deeply ingrained in the cosmopolitan elite of the world that we hardly ever question it or see its resonances. So that's super exciting. So again, looking at AI systems as socio-technical systems, not as something distinct from us, but as instruments that carry our faults and our powers and our benevolence and our shallowness, our greed, our hatreds, and amplify them in some often dangerous ways, but certainly misapply them in contexts for which they are not designed, which is ultimately the story that Rachel is telling here. Okay, so then the third word, right? We've looked at artificial. They're not artificial. Intelligence. They're not all that intelligent. All right, let's get that straight. And time after time after time, we see the ways in which these systems are merely simulating effects that we desire to see in the world and are not actually doing anything that resembles intelligence. So that's an important thing. That's actually work that's been done pretty well. I would be excited to see Rachel echo and expand that in this other context from this other point of view. And then ethics. Rachel has started a really important interrogation of the term of ethics and whether ethics is even the appropriate domain for this conversation. I've had an issue for many years with the sort of loose deployment of the term ethics, largely because most conversations about ethics, most coursework about ethics, most conferences about ethics willfully ignore power. They won't talk about policy. They won't talk about law. They would rather talk about ethics. And they pretend that these problems can be addressed in any meaningful way by the entry-level employees of powerful global companies that have a deep and vested interest in not changing what got them to be rich and powerful, right? Why would a company? Where is the incentive? Does the incentive come from my next crop of students entering these companies at the entry level? Are they ever going to have power within the company? Are they ever going to serve on a board of directors? Are they ever going to be major shareholders? Are they ever going to be in the C-suite? Probably not. So the ethics of the people we trained in the classroom matter very little in these systems. The policy that we exert on these companies from outside, that matters a lot. The legal systems through which they operate, those matter a lot. That's where power is executed. That's the domain in which these decisions should be made. I see ethics as a cop-out, as a way of avoiding the consequences of real action in the world, a way of avoiding responsibility, as much as you might want to call it responsible AI. It's a great way of avoiding responsibility by dodging the very questions of power and structures of power. So all three of these terms deserve to be interrogated and in fact dismantled, and I think Rachel's well on her way to doing this, and by deploying modes of thought that are not dominant or even recognized in the Oxfords and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeleys of the world. I think that's super important here. So I could not be more excited about this project as a whole. I do want to caution Rachel about one thing and make a plea. I've studied the Cambridge Analytica debacle quite deeply. I don't think it serves the argument here for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's no reason to think that what Cambridge Analytica was doing actually involved what we recognize as artificial intelligence or machine learning. There's no reason to think that their systems, the systems that they built, actually deployed any of the classic moves and elements of artificial intelligence. It seemed like simple sorting, right? A simple computer-based algorithmic sorting system based on data input and data output. And so I would say that it doesn't even fit the case, but I would go deeper than that. I think that we have seen time and time again an inappropriate deployment or use of Cambridge Analytica as a villain in the world with the assumption that it actually mattered in the world. I have never seen any evidence that Cambridge Analytica supplied a service that actually did what it said it would do. In other words, I've never seen any evidence that Cambridge Analytica influenced a voter, let alone thousands or millions of voters. I've never seen any evidence that Cambridge Analytica delivered on its promises. The one thing we know about Cambridge Analytica is it was run by thieves and fools and run to take money from other fools, right? Cambridge Analytica worked for hundreds of campaigns around the world over more than a decade, and SLC as well. I'm sorry, SCL as well. But we see no evidence that they actually knew what they were doing. In terms of advertising targeting based on things like personality or things like data analysis, one thing that political campaigns learned in 2016 because of the failures of Cambridge Analytica, and I think the best example of, if you want to know about the failures of Cambridge Analytica as a political consulting firm, you just have to ask President Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz hired Cambridge Analytica first, relied on Cambridge Analytica to supply voter targeting analysis for the Iowa primary and for primaries afterwards. And the people who ran Ted Cruz's campaign have nothing good to say about Cambridge Analytica. They feel they were sold snake oil. And then the Trump campaign was forced by Steve Bannon to take Cambridge Analytica on as one of many consultants in their system. And once again, if you talk to the people who worked with the Trump campaign, around the Trump campaign, especially the digital side, they give no credit to Cambridge Analytica. They say Cambridge Analytica took a bunch of money and did nothing, and really supplied nothing. What worked? Facebook. Facebook itself. The Trump campaign learned, and I think we all should have learned, that you don't need Cambridge Analytica when you have Facebook. Facebook actually has artificial intelligence at a rather advanced level deployed in its ad targeting systems, and through systems like lookalike audiences can do a remarkable job at exactly what everyone hoped Cambridge Analytica would do. So the Trump campaign used Facebook because Cambridge Analytica didn't work for them, and used Facebook quite deftly. And after that, 4 years later, both the Biden and Trump campaigns used Facebook deftly. The Biden campaign learned from the mistakes of the Clinton campaign 4 years earlier. So I think it's really, I also give no credence to anything Chris Wiley says. I think he's another snake oil salesman. I think Chris Wiley rode the notion of being a whistleblower pretty far. But there's no evidence that he ever worked on any of the systems in the case. So anyway, I don't need to go into depth about it. Rachel, you can talk to me on one-on-one if you want to know more of my critiques. You can tell I'm rather worked up about Cambridge Analytica. Anyway, my point being, I think that the examples you use beyond Cambridge Analytica are deeply helpful to your case. I would like you to find another case besides Cambridge Analytica to make your points. So, but thank you again for this paper. I think it's you're going in all the right directions, and I look forward to reading more.
we'll wrap up now and say thank you to everybody, to Christopher, to Siva, and of course, massive thanks to our lead speaker, Rachel, for her terrific and really thought-provoking paper. I wish you all a good evening, a good rest of day, and hope to see you all soon at a future event. And thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.